Well, good afternoon to everybody gathered here for this public hearing with the Minister for Treasury and Resources. Normal hearing standards do apply and a witness statement has been provided. The hearing will be recorded and transcribed as usual, and please do indicate if you wish to speak by using the chat function as we do in the Assembly. Please, if you could speak in order and try not to interrupt, I would be very grateful, and speakers will be shown on video. If members could and officers could remember to mute and turn their cameras off when they're not speaking, it would be very helpful. And if we run out of time for all of our questions, then we ask that the Minister answers them in writing for publication on the panel's COVID-19 review page. All speakers will need to introduce themselves in the usual way for the transcript. So shall we start with our introductions? So I'm Senator Christina Moore and I'm the chair of the Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
Deputy Steve Iyer, Vice Chair.
Karen Shenton-Stone, member of the Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
Richard Vibert, Constable and member of Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
Jess Persh, member of the Corporate Services Scrutiny Panel.
Yes, good afternoon. Susie Pennell, Minister for Treasury and Resources.
Good afternoon. Lindsay Ash, Assistant Treasury Minister.
Good afternoon. Ian Gorst, Assistant Minister. Sorry, I'll do that again. I think there was feedback. Ian Gorst, Assistant Treasury Minister.
Richard Bell, Treasurer.
Richard Summerskill, Comptroller of Revenue.
Stephen Mayer, Group Director in Treasury.
I take it that that's everybody, so thank you all. Let's start with our first question, and Minister, if you could explain to us please what actions and analysis has taken place in potentially sourcing external funding or loans to support the COVID-19 measures, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As you may imagine, quite a lot of work has been going on behind the scenes as to how we approach this, what money we need at the moment, what we will need in recovery. And so moving forward, we are approaching a possible borrowing situation, but it's still not signed, sealed and delivered, so obviously confidentially sensitive. What we hope to be able to do is to preserve the reserves in the strategic reserve for a recovery scenario, and to possibly borrow to cope with the current situation.
Thank you. In the press conference yesterday, your Assistant Minister talked of borrowing £500 million. Could you confirm that that is the amount that you're considering, please?
No, the change which the Assembly agreed to the financial public finance law was to enable the Minister for Treasury and Resources to borrow up to 500 million. That was the change that was made. It doesn't mean to say that that's what we're going to borrow. It just allows up to that sum.
I see. And do you consider that to be a realistic level of borrowing?
Very good question, because we don't actually know quite what the demand is going to be. But I think if we are going to borrow, it's going to be on a 2-year borrowing plan with the possibility of the extension of another year. So that's what we're looking at the moment, but the 500 million is purely the upper limit that the Minister of Treasury and Resources can borrow.
Okay, thank you. What are the forecasted interest rates that are under discussion for that plan at the moment?
May I refer that to the Treasurer, because he's the person who's been dealing with the potential lenders?
Please go ahead.
Richard Bell?
I turned my camera on, but it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, although, yes, the picture is somewhat dark.
The first time it hasn't worked. So we obviously at advanced stages with those. All of those are interest rates linked to the current low level of interest rate. I wouldn't want to be disclosing at this stage what would be commercially confidential at quite advanced stage of negotiation.
Okay, but that's encouraging to hear that it's an advanced stage of the negotiation. At what point do you expect that negotiation to be complete?
I expect us to be in a position by the end of the month or early in May.
Thank you, Treasurer. What are the possible impacts of the large scale of borrowing for COVID-19 on Jersey's credit rating and other projects, such as, of course, the permanent hospital?
Do you want me to answer that, Chair?
If you could, please, Minister.
I think obviously the impact on the credit rating, and now Jersey's credit rating is very, very good at the moment. The UK, they're reassessed every 6 months, the credit ratings, and Jersey's tends to go along with what the UK, but I think in these current circumstances, we would be rated on our own situation, which is very positive. But we don't know yet, and it'll be, I think the Treasurer can probably confirm, but I think it's the end of June, I think, that we get the next credit rating.
Yes, it is. I do apologise about my camera. There we go. Yes, we would be rated on a normal schedule June, July time. We obviously have to, and have indeed done, kept Standard & Poor's up to date with our plans on borrowing, and will do again before final decisions are made. So they're fully aware of our plans. I think it's fair to say, I believe it's within the limits, but actually it's more likely that matters related to COVID-19 and the global position would have more impact on our ratings than this scale of borrowing at this time.
And would there be any impact on the planned changes for raising money to pay for any new hospital that the island was to build?
So the approach that we're proposing to take is, as the Minister has pointed out, a short to medium term facility which will allow ministers, states members and no doubt members of the public to contribute to what the longer, medium to long term strategy is. No doubt if we were to maintain this level of debt up to that maximum, as well as our existing debt, and then seek further debt for example, a hospital, that would make it harder to get away than it would do if we were just at the existing level of debt. But those decisions are for ministers and wider assembly members. So what we're trying to do is maximise flexibility by borrowing at this stage to allow ministers and members to then determine whether we draw down on reserves, we have other measures to repay the debt, or we convert that debt into longer term debt.
Okay, thank you. So you're particularly focusing on short to medium term debt, which I take it means a need, and has been publicised widely this week through the comments of ministers, the requirement of the island to repay that debt in that short to long medium term period. Is that correct?
Yes, so we are further to advice, given that our options are limited at this particular time and that it would take time to secure longer term debt. And given that we don't know what will happen in the future, taking the opportunity to move quickly to secure that immediate facility and allow us time to consider the longer term strategy. But that's not to say that you can't move from the short term facility to a longer term facility. That is one of the options, rather than necessarily using other means to pay that off.
When you say other means, do you mean selling off of assets, perhaps?
It wasn't on the top of the list of possibilities, but obviously that is in essence, if you draw down on reserves, that is selling assets. If that's what you ultimately decide to do, or if that's what we propose to do, selling down the reserves is selling assets. I hadn't envisaged at this point in particular that we'd be looking to sell physical infrastructure. Decisions relating to sale of companies that we may own would take a long time to consider, I have no doubt.
Thank you. You talk about the considerations and the longer term strategy that needs to be implemented, but when making these decisions in the short term about the public finances of the island, what consideration is being given by the Treasury team to the impact of those decisions on the wider economy and the impacts that that economy might have on the public finances position of the future?
Yes, obviously that's part of the whole recovery plan, in as much as everything, as you say, Chair, has got to be incorporated into the wider economy. The workforce, the businesses, everything has to be taken into consideration. At the moment, we are concentrating on trying to deal with the lockdown and the pressures that's having on people considerably in some cases. And then at the meantime, in the background, sort of putting forward plans for recovery for the next 2 years.
Yeah, the Assistant Minister has been on the record to say that business bailout loans will have to be repaid quickly. What is your strategy there in terms of maintaining a thriving economy at the same time as calling upon those people who might have received bailout loans to pay them back in short order?
Well, perhaps the Assistant Minister who said it might like to answer.
I'd be delighted.
Is the Assistant Minister all right?
Yes, Chair. It's the balancing act that the Treasury Minister and her team will need to deliver right across government. I make no apologies for reminding us all that the government doesn't have its own money. The government's money comes from the economy and belongs to taxpayers and contributors. We bring it all together to provide service for islanders in what is, in theory, supposed to be a more cost-effective and delivering on economies of scale to provide frontline services. So both the Minister and I have been quite clear in saying that what we will be doing in borrowing is borrowing against the strategic assets that the island holds. It would be wrong of us not to, at the point that we are doing that, say to islanders, and perhaps maybe it was more about the tone than actually the message, say to islanders that those monies will need to be repaid. Of course, debt has to be repaid, and the strategic reserve will need to be refreshed, and we will need to have a plan in order to do that. And I see no reason why that plan, we shouldn't be talking about it in the short term. But that is not to say, of course, that as we come out of the health element of the crisis, we will need further fiscal stimulus. and ministers will need to consider where they find the resource for that fiscal stimulus and how they stimulate the economy. And so whilst on the one hand it's right to say to islanders that the money we're using now will need to be repaid, it might also surprise some islanders, but I've not been asked about this previously. But I believe that we're going to have a bold plan of fiscal stimulus, and that may not be just in straightforward cash being delivered into projects. We might, in the short term, need to think about some of the taxes that we have as an island, and could they in the short term be reduced to stimulate demand and the economy, whilst at the same time coming forward with a plan to refund and refresh the strategic reserve. I think one of the problems with the comments that I made and the Treasury Minister made was a belief that that was the start and the end of the recovery plan. Of course it's not. It's simply just being honest about what will need to happen down the line and what ministers are going to need to think about, and the discussions they're going to need to have with islanders. And I think somewhere on social media, Treasury have done a lot of this good work in the past, and there's lots of good reports on the shelves that we haven't always accepted. And I think as I'm speaking, I'm not sure if we've sent some of those reports to Deputy Pershard, who asked for it last time we spoke, so we'll check with the Treasury whether that's been done. But certainly in the short term, we might not be in a position, or we might not want to stimulate the economy with cash. We might want to look at creative ways of short-term reduction in taxes. We've seen that happen elsewhere in economic downward trends. The model used elsewhere is often around VAT. We of course have GST, so we could, and I think there'd probably be good economic evidence provided any cuts were passed on to islanders. That would be a really good way of supporting islanders with what might be an increased cost of living because of supply chain constraints and supply chain costs. It could also happen instantaneously, so you can set a date, you can reduce it, and therefore islanders should see the benefit straight away. That would also stimulate virtually every sector apart from financial services, because they have a different way of dealing with GST, the ISE fee, but that could stimulate the economy almost instantly. And we will need to ask our economic advisor to do a bit more work on that. That could be a straightforward, easy, short-term stimulus, as well as the capital projects that we might need to think about and bring forward. And we've seen in the past, after the financial crisis, former Treasury Minister brought forward a large amount of fiscal stimulus, many tens if not hundreds of millions of pounds of fiscal stimulus into the economy. There are lessons we can learn from that, but they worked in producing physical assets into our community that then we could enjoy. So there'll be this stimulus package that we will need to work on and bring forward, but there will also be the need, because I think what we've learned from the past is if we don't talk about the positive spend in the economy at the same time that we're talking about the need to replenish and work together to find ways of refunding monies, we end up doing one, and this is a lesson that we see from around the globe, and we put off the difficult decisions rather than being right up front and open with islanders about what positive decisions and what difficult decisions will follow. But I absolutely am of the view, as I said yesterday, that we go into this crisis in a strong position. We look at the numbers, although they are based on current case scenarios. We don't, of course, know whether there will be a second wave, maybe if we get to autumn and winter, as other countries are looking for the potential second wave. But as we look at the current numbers, I think we can navigate this really, really well because we start in a strong position. That positive, good navigation of the crisis from a financial aspect, and let's not fall into the trap of thinking that when we're talking about finances, we're not talking about benefits to individual islanders, their families and the communities in which they live. Of course they are. You can't separate out numbers and money from all of the human aspects because they are one and the same thing. That's why I'm passionate about them. We shouldn't also then, when we get to the difficult decisions, we'll be in a strong position to make those as well, because we've been talking about them. We've been thinking across a broad number of islanders about what some of the solutions might be, and we need that creative thinking.
Thank you. It's good to hear that there's a discussion going on already about fiscal stimulus, and we'll return to that in just a moment. But if we could just push you slightly, Assistant Minister, on the replenishing of the strategic reserve. A former Chief Minister this week reminded you ministers that it had taken many years to build up the strategic reserves that we have. Many generations have contributed to the strong position that we now find ourselves in. And of course, we are grateful to that. But I think the message from him was that ministers need to be mindful of the time taken to deliver these reserves and perhaps not put too much pressure on replenishing them in a short period of time, because it's simply not reasonable, particularly as we pick ourselves up from a position of crisis.
Yes, I don't want to get into tit for tat with former chief ministers, because I'd find myself in that tit for tat, of course, with current government policy. That wouldn't be helpful for any of us. But I really do strongly believe, and I said it yesterday, and I don't say this to add to the distress that islanders are already feeling, but the old certainties that we have lived with. Let's remind ourselves that this time last year, a pandemic was, yes, there were some people around the globe saying that economies and countries should be prepared for it, but there was not a common consensus that a pandemic like this was so near to us, and that preparation should be done differently from that which the vast majority of countries in the world did. And so we can't sit here now, or when we come into the recovery phase, and make an assumption that it's going to be another 75 years until we hit a rainy day. We need to think very carefully about our obligation to future generations. And let's just remind ourselves, of course, that the vast majority of the value in the strategic reserve was not made because of difficult decisions of previous politicians, although there were some difficult ones made. It was made by good investment decisions, and it was growth in the strategic reserve that's put it to where it was today. Let's remind ourselves, strategic reserve, the first amount was 10 million put in 1986. Between 86 and 91, the politicians of the day managed to put in several £1 million each year. It was 10 million, 10 million, 40 million, 30 million, 20 million, 10 million. Then they had a year off. Then in 93 there was another 17 million, and then in between 94, 5, 6, 7 and 8 money was taken out. 99 there was a net withdrawal. 2000 there was 4 million put in. In 2001 there was 23 million put in, and then in 2007 there was more money put in, and then we know more recently the money that's been taken out for fiscal stimulus as well. So the vast majority of that strategic reserve the former Chief Minister was right to say it was patience that grew that reserve and wise investment decisions. I remember one of my former Treasury Minister as changing the investment strategy of the strategic reserve, and that change of investment strategy, which was more risky, of course, has seen some of the phenomenal growth that we've seen in the collective investment funds, so not only strategic reserve but social security fund, over the last several years. So my point is, it's a point that the former Chief Minister was a point well made, but we can't just make assumptions that everything is going back to how it was prior to this crisis. I think that most commentators feel we can't make an assumption about what COVID might happen again in winter with other waves, and equally whether there won't be more frequent occurrences of rainy days.
Thank you for that. If we could just briefly return to the fiscal stimulus measures, you've outlined some ideas that it appears are being considered, such as reducing GST. However, you briefly touched upon potential capital projects, and one I think was put forward this week during the States Assembly sitting by the Constable of St Helier, who suggested that there's potential for more cycle routes and pedestrian pathways. Would that be a capital measure that ministers would be considering at this point?
Are you addressing that to whom, Chair?
Well, Minister, if you're able to answer, that would be very welcome. Thank you.
Well, I think it was a suggestion by the Constable of St Helier, and as
but it's a sensible suggestion, Minister.
Sorry?
It's a sensible suggestion, Minister, and I'm asking if you would agree.
I'm not disagreeing that it's sensible. I'm just saying that it was a suggestion. And of course, while the traffic is so low at the moment, then it could easily be considered by infrastructure, but I think obviously infrastructure have a huge amount on their plate as well. So I'm not saying it's not sensible. It's just a matter of whether capital in this time should be directed in that way. I don't know what the others might want to say about it.
So may I just, while I have you, Minister, if I could just ask you how quickly you would like to see capital projects begin to stimulate the economy?
I've always been keen on capital projects, but of course anything like that was suggested, like cycle paths, we've got to be very aware that at present we have a social distancing, not quite legislation, but instruction in place, and quite how that would happen at the moment is debatable, but certainly once the lockdown is released, then I think it would be a sensible suggestion to proceed.
Well, I think the islanders hope.
You want me to add to that, Chair, because of course the other element, I didn't hear what the infrastructure minister's answer was to the question of the Constable of St Helier. The minister is right. There are currently lockdown restrictions. It would, of course, we know that the permit system was agreed in the States earlier this week. So some construction sites and works will be starting in early course next week, I would expect, if they get their permits in place under the new permitting regime. Of course, something like the proposal of the Constable would require planning permission. But it seems to me that what we learnt and what Treasury officials keep reminding ministers of, what we learnt last time is you've got to start early. If you start trying to deliver fiscal stimulus too late, then that in itself becomes a problem. So you members or constables or parishes, if they've got ideas that fit into the fiscal stimulus model of timely, targeted and temporary in expenditure nature, that is, then you are right and they are right to be approaching the infrastructure minister and making sure that those particular proposals are duly considered and pushed up the pipeline of work so that those planning processes can be got through, perhaps whilst we're in this health element of the crisis, so that they truly could act as fiscal stimuluses. And it's ideas like that that I think the ministerial team and the Treasury team would like to hear.
Thank you, and hopefully we will pass that message on. I think Deputy Ash wanted to come in with a further point.
Thank you, Chair. I think when we're looking at infrastructure projects, there are no shortages of them around. I mean, the tragic thing is this has occurred just as we were about to get so many, whether it was sporting facilities, looking at Fort Regent. A lot of these projects were about to be pushed forward. And so I don't think we have any shortage of them. It's prioritising which are the important ones. And what I would say, and I'd like to reassure the public on this as well, is that the hospital project we are still pushing ahead with at the moment. I mean, we're not going to go gung-ho on it, but we are still meeting regularly. We're still coming up with the site. We still hope to keep to the timetable. And obviously, I think when it comes to infrastructure projects, and I'm sure you would agree, and I'm sure the island would agree, that has to remain our #1 priority, is to get a new hospital built as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. If I could revert back to the Minister. Minister, do you agree that it's standard policy of the Council of Ministers to leave public finances in a better position than when they took office?
Again, a very good and direct question, Chair. I do feel very strongly that we should not be leaving a debt to the younger generation, which is easier to say than it is to do. As Social Security Minister, I felt the same about not using the Social Security Reserve Fund, leveraging against a debt. And I still feel very strongly that we need to keep our reserves as strong as they are at the moment. However, we are facing a very, very different situation than we faced. People keep referring to the occupation, but I mean, it's a very difficult situation. We will need a huge amount of money to get ourselves out of this, and an equal amount of money to do the recovery programme. So I do feel that we are going to have to bring in fairly strong measures, but over a length of time, not necessarily sort of immediately, so that we don't leave a debt for the next generation.
Thank you, Minister. Is it right to do that in the current circumstances?
I think it depends on the period of time. I don't think we're going to be able to, as I've said before, we're in a strong position because we do have these reserves. But as the Assistant Minister, Senator Gorst, mentioned, that we have not paid in to the strategic reserve since, I think, it was 2002. So we are lucky to have that fund, in as much as previous generations have made sure that we have the backup. And I do feel the responsibility that we should maintain that, not necessarily enhance it, but certainly maintain it. How we do it is under discussion.
Thank you, Minister. I'm now going to hand over to the Vice Chair, Deputy Aye.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, which of these two do you expect to prioritise for the next fiscal year by way of repaying the borrowing that will be incurred, raising taxes or cuts to public services?
Thank you, Deputy. I'm not expecting cuts to public services. Equally, as the Assistant Minister, Senator Gorse, said, we are looking at the tax situation as to whether we reduce or increase. It's all being looked at the moment. There is no, obviously, if you're going to change a tax system, you can't do it overnight. You've got to look at what would fulfill the requirements of the moment, what you can maintain into the future, what would be temporary. I think temporary targeted came up before, and who it would affect most, and be very careful of not unduly affecting the middle band of taxpayers, which came up in my question in the States.
Since we're entering a period of austerity, do you not believe that there should be a reduction in the number of employees in the public sector?
I would hesitate to use the word entering a moment of or period of austerity. I would rather we discussed it in another way, and decreasing employees in the public sector is I don't think on the cards. What we are doing is very, very much slowing down the recruitment.
And how will the efficiencies programme be affected?
Again, that's under review as we speak. Everybody, all departments are looking across this, but we have to be careful where efficiencies are introduced, and not necessarily now, but in the future. We have to be very careful where we are with health, obviously, because there's a huge demand on the health service at the moment, and we can't enforce any efficiencies there. We've got to be careful with efficiencies in the public sector, which have already taken quite a hit, I think, if that's the correct word. So it is all being looked at across departments. And so I can't give you a categorical mathematical answer because it's still being looked at.
Thank you. And what research and lessons learned from the 2008 financial crisis are you using to develop a recovery plan?
Quite a few. Quite a few lessons of quite what not to do, which is why it's taking quite a while. I mean, from your questions, you can appreciate how across the board we're having to react, examine. There's not very much time for public reviews, but trying to keep the public involved and certainly in communication. But not to react spontaneously or as quickly as 2008 and take into effect, which we've got the time to do, i.e. a few months before we send out a review of where we stand with what I think the chair asked before, with the borrowing implications and the spending implications.
And what advice are you receiving or intending to receive from non-government individuals and entities on this issue?
Okay, well, I think as the Treasurer mentioned earlier, we have the Fiscal Policy Panel advising us, and also obviously our auditors, and the next Fiscal Policy Panel report advice forecast will come forward in June, and on that basis we can then move forward with how we're going to advise the next government plan, which I think is now called the Recovery Plan.
Are you looking at bringing in any experts to assist with this issue? And if so, who might they be?
No, we have an economic advisor who is based in the UK, but as I said earlier, the recruitment process has slowed down almost to a stop because we need to concentrate on going forward.
Deputy Pershard has a question now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Deputy IA. I just have a quick follow-up question about the FPP and their advice. Obviously, the FPP's terms and scope are dictated by government. So, for example, all of their recent advice, and I mean in recent history, has been based on an assumption of growth, for example. So the FPP will give their advice based on an unquestioned assumption that is dictated by government. So will the government be seeking to change the fundamental assumption upon which the FPP give their advice?
I'm sorry, Deputy, I sort of lost the last bit of that question. Could you, you said the FPP.
My question is, will the government be instructing the FPP to give advice based on a different set of assumptions to what it previously was based on?
The FPP will do their own set of assumptions, or forecasts, I think is more the word, totally based on their view. And they will give us that, I think I said in June. The last one was possibly better ask the Treasurer, but I think the last one was February.
Sorry, this is entirely my fault. I'm being completely unclear. I asked the FPP if why their forecasting was always based on the assumption of economic growth, infinite economic growth, and they said we base our forecasts on the terms and scope given to us by government. So I was just wondering if the scope or the terms of reference of the FPP were going to change, perhaps to reflect a new societal priority going forward.
Okay, I understand now. Sorry, that was my fault.
Sorry, that's my fault.
Can I refer it to the Treasurer, please?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I am there. So I think in terms, I wasn't there when you asked that question, Deputy, so I'm trying to think of the context. I think the FPP look at the aspirations and aims of government,
yeah,
determining, therefore, their assumptions, and they are assumptions on growth. If government was to say that they no longer aspired to economic growth, or that they had restrictive practices in place, that would come into the FPP's forecast. So we could, I'm just thinking about this, we could ask them if government was to change policies, and that might relate to, for example, not a non-topical subject, migration or population, or other steps in terms of those who could have jobs and those who could only have certain other jobs, then that would come into play. But we could give that some thought and have I talk to you about how we might go about doing that.
Okay, that would be great, because I assume that there will be some shift, whether you say we want faster growth, slower growth, or we're not interested in growth, we're instead interested in stability. You know, all of those kinds of questions, considerations would be questions I assume that you're currently asking yourselves. Is that correct?
So most of that, well, yeah, so they would obviously comment upon, if we put forward plans to stimulate the economy, they would take those into account, but they'll take into account whether they think they are effective. Equally, yeah. So if you were to put in plans to restrict the economy, they would say whether they thought they would be effective or not.
Sure.
They might not comment directly, but it would come into their assessment of the economy going forward.
Great. So my question was, given that that is what they do, has that happened yet? Have those conversations been had? Have any decisions been made about changing those underlying aims and goals of government in relation to the economy?
They haven't and wouldn't be until politicians were to decide that they didn't want to see economic
I was
growth.
asking the Minister that question, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Treasurer.
Sorry, I agree with the Treasurer.
So not yet is the answer.
Not yet. Not yet is the answer.
Thank you, Minister. Back to you, Deputy IF.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister, can you provide detail on the newly established Fiscal Stability Board?
Vice Chair, my understanding is that's all in the public domain when the Chief Minister signed the decision to create that board.
Fine, thank you.
Sorry, I had a bit of trouble with my mute button there, Deputy IA. So there you go. The Assistant Minister's answered. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister. As you have mentioned, changes to taxation are being considered. How will they be coordinated and designed?
Goodness me, that's a very, very wide question. I think as we're already going through the personal tax review, to introduce another review, which we would hope to do, but timing is of the essence, where we would incorporate all sorts of aspects. I think the Assistant Minister mentioned GST earlier, but it could be income tax, it could be on a temporary basis, which I think it would. It could be all sorts of releases of caps on Social Security, on long-term care, on an increase in Social Security contributions. There's a massive, massive amount to be considered, and it will not be done in a hurry or overnight.
So will they follow traditional routes, or can we expect a more radical shift in the approach to taxation?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean by a radical approach.
Well, there was mention of tax on property, for example.
Nothing has been decided yet, so every sort of consideration, I don't think a tax on property is necessarily appropriate. I think we need something that's more across the board, but we have to work out whether we're going to reduce taxation as described by the Assistant Minister in one area and then increase in another area. And until we do a very, and I keep saying balanced review, we can't decide at the moment.
Have any tax increases or decreases that were within the 2020 government plan, such as fuel duty, for example, been delayed or scrapped as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak?
No, the government plan was agreed by the Assembly, so that's still going ahead. As I mentioned earlier, the government plan, which may now be called the recovery plan, which should be lodged in September, with hopefully enough time for scrutiny to have a look at it, to be debated in December, will include some different measures because of COVID-19.
But the GST de minimis level, which was agreed, that has now been deferred, has it not?
It has. That was agreed to reduce it from £240 to £135 from July 2020. It's been deferred because we would have had to have recruited more customs and immigration officials to deal with it, which we knew that was costed in. But at the moment, they have a huge amount of excess work to do with a vast increase, as everybody will understand, of online orders. Therefore, it was decided rather than put excess pressure on that system, we would defer it until January 2021.
And will the 0-10 tax base be reconsidered?
That is part of the equation, but not in any way other than just part of the equation for every other tax measure that is also being considered.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
When do you intend to decide upon your future strategy? how long will it be?
Well, as I've just said, when we put into place the government / recovery plan, hopefully to be lodged in September, it may be October, because obviously there's a huge amount of work involved in doing this. It'll all be there, and Scrutiny will have a view of it beforehand.
Concerning the possibility of property taxes, if the recovery is not managed carefully, would you agree that property values could plummet, therefore impacting any revenue that could be gathered through such a scheme, and also affecting the value of properties held by the government?
Well, that's two different questions. The value of properties, personal properties maybe, is very difficult to assess because there's no movement in the property market at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when we move out of lockdown. As far as the assets of the island of Jersey in property, there's a considerable amount, and I am very keen that we, instead of just leaving them in the background, do something about them and either develop them, sell them, or both.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to hand over to Deputy Parashar now.
I wonder if, sorry, Vice Chair, I wonder if I could just remind the Vice Chair of the Fiscal Policy Panel's advice and forecast, which suggested that property values could fall by around 10% as a result of the COVID crisis.
Thank you, Assistant Minister.
Thank you. Minister, I'm just going to ask you just a couple of questions to elaborate on what you've already said about the recovery plans or exit strategies. So just as a starter, what's your role within designing and preparing the exit and recovery strategy for Jersey?
Thank you, Deputy. Do you mean financially?
Yes.
Yes. Quite a strong role there, together with my two assistant ministers and the Treasury team, the economic development team. Obviously, there's a huge, not to mention health, huge amount involved in all of this. So there are meetings day after day after day, sort of all day, in finding a way forward that's positive for all islanders. And I think, as has been incorporated in various answers preceding this one, that we have to look at every opportunity to work to a full recovery without too much demand on possibly the areas of population taxpayers that after this lockdown will not be able to necessarily afford to go forward in a very strong way. We've got to consider student finance. We've got to consider the demand on social security. So there's a huge amount to consider. So it is being done, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. Sure.
Just so that we can better understand the structures around this development. There has been established, if I'm correct, a recovery working group within the emergency measures plan structure. Are you a member of that group?
Yes, that was discussed this morning, actually, at a Council of Ministers meeting, that we do a recovery plan for 21 to 24, which of course was going to be the government plan. So the titles change by the day. But yes, and I think the Assistant Minister mentioned timely, targeted and temporary as to the approach of that group.
And the recovery working group, is that essentially the Council of Ministers, or is that a separate group of which you are a member with other members? And if so, who else is on it?
Goodness me, it's a separate group, but I can't actually give you a list of who else is on it. I don't know if anybody else online has got that information.
if not,
Clearly not.
be happy to receive it.
I will get it back to you, Deputy Pershard.
Thank you very much indeed. Regarding a full recovery, what does that mean to you? Does that mean a return to what we had before? Is there going to be a new normal established in your view? And how will society and members of the community be able to input their values to you so that any new policy that comes through in the recovery reflects the values of society that may have shifted from a pre-COVID society?
I couldn't agree with you more. And we do need to, this new normal phrase, I suppose it's acceptable, we do need to move to that because it won't be the same. I don't think it should be the same. I think that this is my personal view, this is not Council of Ministers' view, that we have become a little complacent about our situation. We need to readdress the way social security contributions are made, whether the cap is viable, on long-term care. And as I've mentioned in an answer before, as to the taxes that we pay, and that's across the board taxes, I'm not picking out one above the other, but whether they are correct. And I think, because I'm an optimistic person, that we should make the best out of a crisis. And we've been given an opportunity to do this. There's also the question of whether we put into the mix moving to current year payment of taxes from the prior year basis, which we've been trying to do for quite a long time. But of course, that has to be very, very carefully managed so that people don't lose out on that. So there's an enormous amount in the mix. But no, I don't think, in answer to your question, we will go back to where we were before. And I hope that with the input of the entire States Assembly and the public with reviews, that we can come up with a way forward that's acceptable to most. It'll never be acceptable to all, but certainly to most. So thank you.
Fantastic to hear, and I'm very excited to hear about your plans going forward. Just developing on that, and I appreciate the answer might be, I can't tell you this yet, but there is a school of thought in economics based on the work of John Maynard Keynes, who suggested that to close a recessionary gap, and we are having to think along those lines at the moment, you can either increase government expenditure or cut taxes, or a bit of both. But in the academic writing around this theory, it is widely acknowledged that more progressive liberal governments tend to go for government expenditure, and more conservative governments tend to go for tax cuts. And obviously, the middle go for the middle. Where would you say we are, given we have just given the Treasury the remit to spend more money? Where do you think we are on that scale, and could this be a time where we start moving to a more equitable, progressive society?
Again, a very good question. We have the Assembly has given the Treasury Minister the power to spend more money, and power is not my word, it's in the law. I hope that we're not going to need it, but if we do, we have to react very quickly, as we did with the hospital, the Nightingale Hospital, and PPE, so personal protective equipment. So we have to be able to react very quickly at the moment. Now, how we move forward is the whole big discussion as to whether we do borrow to the limit that's been agreed or not, and then how we recoup that with using the strategic reserve. So it's still in the equation as to how much money we're going to need.
I've gone off piste on my question plan, so I'll bring it back to what I'm supposed to be asking you about. Have you designated any additional duties or authorities to officers to cope during this emergency? Perhaps the Treasurer or the Comptroller of Revenue, for example?
The Treasurer and his team and the Comptroller and his team have been working 24/7. They really have been amazing with what they've been doing in answering everybody's questions, trying to put forward dealing with the current situation. And the Treasurer today presented to the Council of Ministers a potential recovery plan, which was agreed. All this is a huge amount of work for which we should all be very grateful. I think that the Assistant Minister, Ian Gorst, wanted to say something. I don't know if it was on the last question or this one.
I'll take either. Thank you.
Ian?
Thank you, Deputy. Yes, it was on the last question, which, of course, I can endlessly talk theoretically about these issues. Hopefully, you've got a little feeling for where my general direction was when I was talking earlier about the possible fiscal stimulus in the short term. Of course, if we were to deliver a measure like that, and that's very much my view, not a joined Council of Ministers view, by cutting GST, but that's one thing. And as you say, there's economic theory that would support that view. But equally, of course, we have already in government spending things that we call automatic stabilisers that we would automatically put increased funding into. And in our case, of course, that's mostly around income support. And Social Security is seeing greater numbers in income support. I was just trying to have a look on my iPad for the numbers from yesterday, but I think from, if memory serves, from the beginning of April, they've seen something like 600 extra claims. That's on top of many hundreds towards the end of March. They'll be, of course, publishing those figures. There's actually slightly more, around 800, I think, people registering with the back to work team, so saying they're unemployed but they've got their own resources, so they're not calling on income support, but they might do in time. So it's you've got the automatic stabiliser, so that's going to be increasing government expenditure in the short term. I really think we need to think about tax lowering measures that get money into the economy and allow individuals to decide how they're going to spend their own money, rather than this reversion to big government, which what this crisis tells us is that that's not necessarily a sensible approach either. Because government isn't necessarily respected in the way that we might like it to be in our community or in any Western community. And then you've also got the capital expenditure element, so that's increased spending into the economy, which government is delivering, but that can be delivered in a private-public partnership way. So that really bridges the two economic theories. And of course, I am also a great believer. I think the Vice Chair used the word austerity. I mean, let's be honest, even during what people are now referring to in the past, post the financial crisis, where the government managed to keep spending level, i.e. it managed to some extent control the increase in spending. That's not austerity. Austerity is where you are fundamentally cutting government budgets and not spending. Jersey has not seen that, even though some political persuasions might try and indicate that we have. I very much believe that there's an opportunity now, along the lines that the Minister has indicated, that in the current government plan for 2020, that's where we are now, there is quite a lot of growth money in there that, with the best will in the world, I don't think is going to be deliverable. And some of that growth money is on extra jobs in the public service. The only extra recruitment that we want to be doing in the public service right now, and I sort of raised it yesterday around the mental health debate in the States, I think they need more support, and I think the Assistant Minister with responsibility for mental health recognised that the decision yesterday might mean more money needs to be spent there, so we could try and recruit there. We're obviously repurposing employees onto the health front line and the frontline emergency services, so they need to continue to be supported. But elsewhere, we're not going to have the bandwidth to spend that extra growth money. I think that's a good thing, but that's not reducing expenditure from previous years. It's just meant that we're not going to see the growth that we had planned when we agreed the government plan. So I verge on the allow islanders to make their own decisions by cutting taxes for the short term, and yet at the same time I know that there is an element of government policy which will deliver government growth in expenditure as well.
Thank you. And just while we're on it, are you able to confirm that officers are being asked to cut their budgets in all departments, including education?
I'm not aware that officers are being asked to cut their budgets, but they are, other than, of course, with regard to the what we've referred to as efficiencies. That's a word which gets stretched to cover a multitude of sins, if we can describe it like that. They're not being asked to cut their budgets. They're being asked realistically between now. So over the next 2 quarters or even the end of the year, how much of the budget that we've allocated are you realistically going to be able to spend? If I take my everyday department in external relations, of course, sadly for some, perhaps even in the Gorst household, I am not able to travel because of the lockdown provisions. And so that will be a saving of several £1,000 because nor are officials travelling. So that saving can be handed back to the central budget, and it's money that we're not spending, and it's money that can go towards funding the COVID crisis. So all departments are being asked to re-evaluate their budget and see are they actually going to spend what was allocated to them. And I think with the exception of health and the other frontline services, of course, education is going to remain fairly static in that regard because teachers are doing remote lessons, as well as those teachers which are going into school to provide education for essential families of essential employees. So that's probably a fairly static budget from what was given, and there won't be much flex in it, but I haven't seen the numbers from there. I say this is the exception of health, but let's remember as well, the hospital right now has got a lot of spare capacity, and that's on purpose, preparing that capacity for the COVID crisis. So the operations and the normal operations in the health department are not taking place. So what effect that might have on their budget in the medium term, I don't know. I think it will be more than balanced out with the increased spending in the COVID-19 provision, but all other departments are being asked to reanalyse their budgets.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I'm going to ask 2 more quick questions and I'm going to hand over to the next speaker to ask their questions. Excuse me, I'm just making sure that I'm not going to repeat myself. Minister, what further actions, if any, have taken place in Treasury to ensure speedy government payments to contracted businesses, as well as in government procurement?
Sorry, the question being was, has there been...
what further actions, or what actions, if any, have been taken to ensure speedy government procurement and speedy payments to businesses contracted by government?
Okay, I think mainly this refers to health. that were your question?
Yes. I was in a written question I put in on Tuesday. I was told that the Director of Commercial Services was the lead for emergency procurement, but was working alongside the state's treasurer.
Okay, the emergency procurement has been largely for health. It was extraordinary the way it worked for the Nightingale Hospital, in as much as there were several people involved in a 2-week appraisal of how we could do this, and an outstanding presentation. Sorry, I just must have a glass of water.
Sure.
As to how we could do it, where we could do it, where the sites were, what had been looked at, what had been refused because of difficulties. So I won't go into all that detail because that's not what you were asking. But that procurement, if you like, and the 14.4 million, which is the publicised figure, was agreed very quickly. But the actual hospital itself, which is sort of like a prefab, is there for 3 months with a possibility of extending if we need it. That was the sort of only 1 million part of that. Then there was the workers who put it up. There's the 180 beds that are going to be put into it. The facilities, utilities that had to be put through the field to make it work. So it can happen extraordinarily quickly, and it does. And it's quite a responsibility, which I take very, very seriously, to acknowledge.
Sure.
The sign-off.
Sorry, thank you. How much has been spent so far by the government tackling COVID-19?
Well, it changes daily, but it's going to be, with the co-payroll scheme, by the end of June, about £300 million.
Thank you. And how has that been funded primarily? Is that all come from the same place?
From the movement of heads of expenditure to the general reserve, which then funds the immediate checks, if you like, of these demands.
Thank you. And finally, what is the income deficit expected for this year as a result of COVID-19?
Right, well, I could answer that if I could find it on my other screen, but may I refer you to the Treasurer for this one, because he's probably got it in front of him. I'll try and find it as well.
Sure. Oh, actually, Chair, would you be content with that information coming to us in written form, and I can pass on to the next member? I'm just conscious of time.
I think
we can send it to you.
Thank you. That would be great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Constable Shenton Stone. Thank you for your answers, Minister and Assistant Minister.
Not at all. Thank you, Deputy.
Good afternoon, Minister and everybody. I have a question for the Minister. Do you believe the communication from your department regarding COVID-19 has been adequate? And if not, what do you believe needs to be improved?
Very good question. I've been in politics since 2011 and have never thought that the communication to the public was adequate. I think in the current situation, to answer your question, I think we're doing as much as we can because everything changes on an hourly basis. I know because I'm part of it. And the figures change, the people change in as much as what they're inputting, the percentages, the COVID-related figures change. So It's a very difficult question to answer because it's constantly changing, and I think that putting out the media assimilation, which we do 3 times a day, plus the update on COVID at least twice a day, and certainly in the evening, is a vast improvement on what we had.
Yes, thank you. And have your assistant ministers been following the same communications plan for these announcements, or have any public statements that have been made by them come from their own views and not from those of Treasury?
I think some have come from their own views, which of course they're entitled to say. I mean, we are in a democracy.
Yes, of
but
course.
I think generally speaking, as Treasury, we're united in the way we want to go forward in this recovery plan, government plan. It's very difficult to know what it's called at the moment. So we're all united in how we want to go forward and in the review of how we're going to get there to do that. I know that sounds a bit vague, but at the moment we don't know exactly how we're going to move with taxes and social security contributions. But yes, I think the assistant ministers are both entitled to their own views, and I know one is waiting to speak.
Thank you. Were you waiting to speak?
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. Constable, do you want to repeat that question?
No, I was just saying, had you wanted to speak?
Oh, yes, please. Can I ask you just to clarify what it was that you were referring to when you were asking about the Treasury Department's communication, which indicated it hadn't been what you'd wish it to be?
No, I wasn't saying it wasn't what I wished it to be. I was just asking generally whether you know that the communications needed to be improved, or whether all the communications coming out were Treasury's point of view, or some of them your own views.
I think Conatab, you were saying that were we united in our views or not?
Yes.
So I think the Minister is right in saying that as a Treasury team we are united in our view. I have represented the Treasury Minister at a couple of media conferences because, as we know, the Treasury Minister is at home, and I'm able to get into town and do those. And I have only said in those particular briefings, the bit that's controversial, let me be clear, that people have criticised me for, that was a line agreed by the Council of Ministers. So I stand by that line. I fundamentally believe in being honest when you are providing a support in explaining what decisions may need to be taken in due course to repay debt and to replenish the reserves. We as a government are working together, hopefully in what we can all agree is the best interests of the island. But when it comes to more everyday communication, that is being handled by the Central Communications Department, and the Treasury team and the Treasury Department are very much second fiddle to that. Most of the communication is emanating either from the Chief Minister or the Health Minister. The Treasury Minister is beavering away in the background, providing audit and review around decisions and signing the checkbook. And as a general rule, others perhaps are taking the glory for the decisions and the schemes that she's bringing forward.
Oh, thank you. And I was just going to say, what work have you undertaken with other departments, but you probably touched on that, to communicate future plans with regards to taxation and public finances, and which internal bodies are involved?
Are you asking me as Minister?
Yes.
Yes. What do you mean by internal bodies, please?
Other other sections of the government?
Okay, well, we've got obviously the Council of Ministers, we've got an emergency council, we've got a competent authorities ministers meeting, all of which take place now 3 times a week. So fitting that in between state sittings and the internal, in my case, Treasury Ministers meeting, is quite difficult. And also I'm on the State's Employment Board, to mention but a few. So it's quite a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just move on to the next question because we're short of time, so thank you. What impact has COVID-19 had on those living in Jersey with special taxation statuses, such as 21Es?
I'm not quite sure what the question is supposed to be, because they will have the limitations that everybody else does.
Do you know if any of them have left the island?
I don't, no.
Okay, and are you aware that some are considering their future here due to the announcements that have been made?
I'm not aware, but I wouldn't be surprised. But actually, from what I generally hear, I'm a Jersey girl, so I'm biased anyway, but very few are preparing to leave. They love Jersey.
Thank you. I'll hand over to the next questioner, which is Constable Richard Vibert. Thank you.
Thank you, Conatable.
Sorry about that. A few computer problems at this end. Good afternoon, everyone. And as we've got very little time, I'll probably not ask all the questions that I had. Firstly, Minister, how has the new tax system coped with working from home? Have you been able to maintain an expected standard of processing, or has there been a slowdown?
It's a very good question, in as much as it's arrived at the same time as the COVID, with all the technical issues that we had. And I think the tax system has coped admirably. I would say that, of course, but it has coped admirably with the delays that we've had. So, sorry, there's something going on. Hello?
Hello?
Oh, you're still there. Okay.
Yes, I'm still here. Yes, yep.
Coped admirably with the delays that have been going on because of the online filing, because of the move to Lamott Street, all the reasons that have been perpetuated beforehand. So I don't think that this has made any difference whatsoever.
Thank you. Have any members of Revenue Jersey been seconded onto other COVID-19 response teams or initiatives, and has this affected the way that Revenue Jersey operates?
May I ask the comptroller to take that question, because it's his team?
Yes, of course. If I may, I'll also just comment slightly on the last question, which is that thankfully, because the new systems were in place before Christmas, we have been able to offer online filing, and also our staff have been able to work from home on government laptops.
Mr. Summerskill, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you could answer the question that's been put, because we're now very short of time and we have.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
In respect of your main question, a number of staff are working on secondment in customer and local services, helping with the payroll co-payment scheme.
Thank you. And moving on. What is the expected drop in state's revenue through taxation for 2020 compared to 2019? are you able to predict how COVID-19, what the drop is likely to be?
May I ask the comptroller, please?
I think the Treasurer may want to come in on this. Obviously, the income forecast group is still working on income forecasts based on the FPP's assumptions, but the Treasurer does chair the group, so he may wish to say more.
Thank you.
Hello there. Can you see me? Oh, no. Yeah, as the comptroller said, we are currently going through the finalisation of the income forecast and expect that to be available for members early May, and that will give you some indication of the scale of impact that we expect from the changed economic assumptions. We're also monitoring, although it has yet to have had a significant impact given how early in the crisis we are in terms of cash flow, and we'll be able to update that throughout the year.
Thank you. And would you expect recovery in 2021, so that revenue levels in 2021 would perhaps match those of 2019, or do you expect a longer term general shock to the economy leading to a more sustained reduction in revenue?
So I'd probably speak back to my last answer around the income forecast. We are developing that. I think it is the aim should be that we take every step possible to ensure as much of the economic recovery comes back as quickly as possible, but there's probably an inevitability to seeing that we will have some degree of protracted recovery, and to some degree we will struggle to catch up with where we were previously forecasting income to be over the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay, I know it is very difficult to predict at this stage, so thank you very much. So the final question, how has the disruption caused by COVID-19 affected the move towards independent taxation? When can Ireland now expect this to take place?
A very good question, and as I've said all the way through, that I would like this to be in 2021. However, it's not delayed as we speak, but obviously with the current demands on Treasury and Revenue Jersey, it may see a slight delay. I hope it won't, because I've been a forerunner of wanting to do this along with Deputy Pershard and Deputy Doublé, but there are priorities to be met.
Thank you. And which non-COVID-19 policy issues do you intend to continue with through 2020, and which do you expect to be delayed?
I'm not quite sure which ones you're referring to.
Not really referring to any specific ones, really. Which policy issues are you able to continue with? Perhaps that might be an easier question.
Okay, well, as we've mentioned throughout this hearing, we will address everything that comes forward. It's very difficult to prioritise from hour to hour, let alone day to day, as to what we're going to proceed with when it comes to policies, health, tax, hospitals. It's just got to be dealt with a consideration of the timing.
Thank you very much. No, I do appreciate how difficult it is to provide some specific answers to these, so thank you very much. And that brings our question plan to an end at this stage.
Thank you very much.
Minister, before you go, if I could just ask one final question, please, which would be, you mentioned earlier that you and your ministerial team are fully aligned and of a shared vision. I just wondered if you could, before you go, describe what that shared vision is of your direction, particularly at this difficult time.
May I ask what direction you're going in? Because there are so many.
I'm asking you for your particularly shared direction. I was quoting you back at yourself, I'm afraid.
Oh, right. Okay, shared direction with my assistant ministers and my Treasury team is that what we need to do is to move forward and, in my view, put politics to one side and look at the view of the financial, quote, sustainability, unquote, of Jersey, and how we re-establish ourselves in a different way. And I quite accept various other people's political views that we need to possibly change the way forward. And I've said this before, and I think in an answer this afternoon, with the way we deal with Social Security, with the way we deal with tax. And I think that the team are all in accordance with looking at the different ways of moving forward.
Thank you for that. If I could just pick you up slightly there, the point of having democratically elected politicians is that they might put their political direction to the task at hand. Would you not agree?
Yes, I would, and I know exactly where you're coming from. But of course, we are democratically elected and everybody has their point of view and are permitted to say so and will continue to do so.
Okay, well, we have run slightly over time this afternoon, so I thank you all very much for your attendance, and I close the hearing.
Thank you, Chair.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye.